Good morning. My name is Martin Hackli. I will be chairing the first session. And we're not running all too late, so I'm going to not delay any further. We have three speakers. We have Beth Levin from Stanford, Idan Landau from Ben Gurion, and Ray Jackendoff from Tufts. The procedure will be as follows. We will have three 20-minute talks, each one followed with a short Q&A period. Each one followed with agreement with the speakers by a very short quick Q&A period, and then there will be a general Q&A period. I will be moderating the Q&A. I will point to people. There will be two students who have microphones, so please raise your hand and I will address the students to find you and get you the microphone. I'll try to be fairly strict about timekeeping so that we can get lots of questions and that we can also keep to the schedule. There are two handouts. The first talk by Beth Levin does not have a handout, it has a slide. The handouts have been distributed. If you don't have one, please raise your hand. There are students who will find you and give you a handout. There's also a website for those who have a computer with you where most of the handouts can be accessed. The website is listed here. It's basically the department's website address followed by handouts 50. Okay. One last announcement before we get started. This is for those who have a poster. You were told that you should put up your poster during the lunch break. It turns out that the staffing of the poster boards is a bit behind. What we would like you to do is bring your poster to the seminar room on the fourth floor in the Stada Center and drop it off in that room, and we will have people who will put up your poster when the boards have been delivered. Okay? Okay, very good. So our first speaker is Beth Levin, and let's go.
I think it just needs to be logged in again. But anyway, while they're doing that, I'll get started. The organizers asked that I talked about the Lexicon project, which I most likely would have done anyway, since my 4 years coordinating the project in comparative lexicography was instrumental in shaping my own research program, and it's something I've followed on over the years. And in fact, generally, I think it had a wide and continuing influence on work on the lexicon-syntax interface. So what I want to do is briefly review the project and its goals, even though I won't be able to fully do it justice. And then I would like to present a current ongoing case study of mine, which I believe instantiates the project's goals and illuminates its approach to linguistic phenomena. So, as I said, this was a project in comparative lexicography with Ken Hale and Jay Kaiser as principal investigators, and around for about 6 years during the 80s. I and Carol Tenney coordinated the project during that time, and there were various postdoctoral fellows, but more important, just about everyone who was around the department at that time seemed to have participated in some way, as I discovered going through some of the annual reports of the project. Moving on to the project goals, it was really a two-pronged research program that on the one hand tried to document the lexical resources of less studied languages, and on the other develop a theory of lexical knowledge. So going on with the first goal, there were 4 less studied languages that were the focus of the project: Berber, Walbury, Winnebago, and though not lesser studied, English also played a part. That was my role. And then the project also supported work on many other languages, including Igbo, Arabic, Miskito, Ulua, and Japanese. Now let me turn to the second goal, developing a theory of lexical knowledge. On the one hand, the goal was to formulate maximally simple lexical entries which account for a native speaker's lexical competence, and this required discovering elements of meaning which recurred systematically in the definition of words and the principle which determined the mapping from lexical semantics to morphosyntax. And I think these ideas are most effectively spelled out in, I think, a not dated short piece by Ken Hale, which I think most people have never seen. So what did this mean day to day? In order to kind of articulate the kinds of principles that were being searched for, the thing that the project strived to do was to study regularities in the behavior of lexical items, particularly verbs, and one result of this was my own book on English verb classes. Ultimately, I think one perspective on this whole research program was published as Ken and Jay's book, Prolegomena to a Theory of Argument Structure. But there are many reflections of the Lexicon project and other ongoing work in linguistics, and I just want to mention two. One is the use of syntactic structures that have been motivated by event structure considerations, including as spectral notions, and these ideas, for instance, were inspired in part by Carol Tenney's spectral interface hypothesis. And another is the notion of root, which, even if named by David Pisetsky, I think reflected the importance of a verb's core meaning to determining its argument realization property. So let me now move on to the nature of the Lexicon project investigations as a prelude of this case study. So there are two dimensions, a within-language dimension and a cross-language dimension. So within a language, once we identified verbs with distinct kinds of syntactic behavior, the goal was to formulate distinct lexical entries for these verbs, which in conjunction with argument realization principles would give rise to the distinct syntactic behavior, as this particular quote from one of the early products of the whole Lexicon project, Major Participants, shows. But as I said initially, this was a project on comparative lexicography, and it was comparative because it acknowledged that languages could differ in how a given set of verbs could realize their arguments. And the goal here was to understand how particular typological characteristics of a language could lead to such differences among languages despite having similar lexical semantic underpinnings. And here I'm citing this unpublished piece by Ken. So what I would like to do now is present an ongoing case study of mine that I think is very much cast in this comparative mode. And as it's ongoing, there's lots that still remains to be done. And what I've started looking at is the verb hit, which is a verb that has long attracted interest, including by the Lexicon project, but usually is a counterpart to the verb break, which has received the lion's share of attention. And what I'd like to show is that there are differences in the way that languages encode hitting events that reflect differences in their grammatical and lexical resources. So here's a few hitting verbs. Depending how broadly you define this class, it could be 30, 50, 100 verbs. And what interests me is sort of the VP with hitting verbs, and specifically the expression of their arguments, and particularly the surface argument, like in the boy hit the fence, that's the surface, with the stick, an instrument. Okay. So starting with English, these verbs show various ways in which they realize their arguments, and I've got the surface in bold, and I think the sort of major generalization to be drawn here is the surface can be an object, but it doesn't have to be an object. Now, if we turn to other languages, and it turns out these verbs get sporadic mentions in many languages, we see there's a variety of patterns, which I have listed here, and I'll go through them one by one. And some of them actually are the same as in English, but there are some differences. So let me just go through these now. So the first one is where the surface is an object, as you get in English, but you find instances of this in many languages, and most languages have several options. I'm not giving language data because to keep this briefer, but I've got sort of schematics of the VP. The other alternative is something like in Smith hit at the fence, where you have the surface as an oblique or in a preposition phrase. Moving on, there are languages where the choice between these two options seems to depend on the animacy of the surface. So it's an object if you have an animate, like Smith hit Jones, but in oblique if inanimate. And I think you see this better with bite, where you might bite a person, but you're more likely to bite into or at an apple. The more interesting one, I think, is languages where you seem to have verb-noun combinations that have sort of the content of a hitting verb, and the surface is then expressed as an oblique. It's sort of like in English, the horse gave a kick to my shin. And here, give a kick has something like the content of the verb, and this content of this noun could be like an instrument or some other kind of thing like kick here. And this option seems to take several forms across languages. You can get a light verb like in the give a kick, or in Portuguese and Spanish, this seems to be the preponderant way to talk about hitting events. You can have some sort of basic verb of hitting, like in Chechen English and Lhasa Tibetan, where you say things like hit fist for punch or hit knife for stab. Or you can have a cognate object construction like hit a hit, which you get in Vietnamese. So the questions these raises are these. What gives rise to the different realizations of the surface? What is the reason for the verb-noun combinations? And what are the interactions between the two properties? And although I haven't quite gotten to the bottom of this, I have a few thoughts to share. So let me start by saying one of the big lexical distinctions that Malka Rappaport-Hovav and I have been pursuing is a distinction between what we call manner verbs and result verbs, where result verbs describe changes into a state, scalar changes, we usually say, such as break and cool do. So with the verb like break, you cannot deny the result, as in the first of the two sentences in the first bullet. But you can talk about many ways of bringing about this result. So you can break a vase by hitting it with a hammer, dropping it, or so on. In contrast, hit is a manner verb that describes some sort of action without talking about a particular result. So if you hit a vase, you might indeed break it. That's not contradictory. But what is contradictory is to try and say you did it in some other, do some other way at the same time. You can't further specify an alternate means of bringing about what might have been a potential result. So this manner result verb distinction, Malka and I have claimed, matters for argument realization. And what we found, and sort of abstracting away from a lot of work on verbs like break and so on, is the result verbs show a restricted range of argument realization options that basically comes down to what I have here, an argument that has a result predicated of it must be realized and can only be realized as a direct object. Now, surfaces with hitting verbs, since hitting verbs or manner verbs don't have results necessarily predicated of them, and so this constraint does not apply to their realization, and therefore these may be objects or obliques, which, as I say, are the major patterns that are observed. Now, there's still the question of animacy effects, and I'm not exactly sure what's behind them, but it seems to me there are two reasons they might arise, which have to do with the special status of animates, which is known to affect their argument realizations options. Elsewhere, one animates might be seen as being affected, and this is an idea that's pursued in several recent papers, or it may have to do with the informational structure prominence of animates, which plays a role in the expression of recipients and double object constructions. But what I really want to talk about is less the animacy effects than what's going on with the verb-noun combinations. And in languages with the verb-noun combinations, the noun in that combination basically is the object, perhaps because it's something like an incorporated noun and needs to be the sister of a verb. But the consequence of this is that the surface itself cannot be realized as an object, so an alternate realization is needed, and obliques are available for surfaces, although the specific oblique might depend on, for example, the like verb you have. So it might be a goal if it's give, or a location if it's put. But the other question is, why are we seeing these verb-noun combinations? And I think here this might be traceable to differences among languages with respect to the size and nature of their verb inventory. And this is not something that really gets examined a whole lot, but it is documented that languages differ in their verb inventories. And some ways in which verb inventories differ are listed, so that there are languages where you only have a handful of light verbs. There are languages where property concepts, basically adjectival notions, are verbs, and others like English where they're not. And then finally, there is a set of work that shows that there are languages where the inventories of manner verbs are reduced in contrast to what you see in English. Studies of the lexicalization patterns of motion events are in fact the place where these reduced verb inventories have mainly been documented. So in languages like French, Hebrew, Spanish, or Turkic, so-called path languages where verbs like go or ascend are used to generally talk about motion events, there have been studies that show there are many, many fewer manner of motion verbs, things like amble, walk, saunter, and so on, than in languages like English, where manner of motion verbs are directly used in the expression of directed motion events, and this has been documented for several languages. So I would like to propose that these verb-noun combinations are sort of a reflex of something similar, that they arise in languages with smaller manner verb inventories. In fact, some of the languages in which they're attested are indeed languages that are path languages in the motion event encoding sense. And in these languages, you must have some kind of device to express notions that might be lexicalized as verbs in English, so that you can make distinctions between either the different kinds of manner, say, of walking verbs, or the different kinds of hitting verbs, or so on. And verb-noun combinations are one way to augment the lexical inventory, so they'd allow you to express a wider range of hitting events. Thus, the English verb kick is translated as basically give a kick in Portuguese. And this particular study I cite sort of lists about 50 or 60 such combinations, only maybe a third of which actually have a basic verb equivalent. This is one way of augmenting a small verb inventory. I think there are various other ways, and I'll just mention another one which has been documented in the hitting domain. And this is through the use of verb idiophone, or verb mimetic, if you prefer that term, combinations. And in a paper, in several papers on Japanese, one about the motion domain, Shibatani and Weinhold show the use of idiophones to express some of the different, say, manners of walking in Japanese, and Kageyama documents this for sound emission, various kinds of body internal motion, and bodily processes. And Kageyama also shows that such combinations may be used in Japanese to express various types of hitting events. So something like Smith the wall bang hit, or whatever, these idiophones that are different kinds of hitting. So in these combinations, the verb is either the verb hit or a light verb suru. So this way of augmenting the verb lexicon, of course, has repercussions for argument realization. When you have a verb-noun combination, you don't have the option of expressing the surface as an object. When you have the verb-idiophone combinations, generally the surface is still expressible as an object, even if there's still issues about the actual nature of idiophones. So just to move towards a conclusion, I hope to have shown how cross-linguistic diversity in the encoding of hitting events can be traced to differences in the basic lexical, syntactic, and morphological resources available to languages, even if the kind of basic semantic components they are building on are the same. And I have done another joint study with John Beavers and Xiaowei Tom, where we make similar points in the domain of motion events. And so this case study reinforces, I think, what Ken wrote, that there are direct relationships between principles which operate in the lexicon and grammatical parameters which define the typological position of a language along particular dimensions. And just as final words, again from the same thing by Ken, this, while the lexicon is notoriously the domain of the idiosyncratic, it is becoming increasingly apparent that it's also the domain of principles of great generality. And just to leave you an entry from the Walbury Dictionary for hit. Thank you.
Ken Sapphire, for those of you who can't read the tag. I just wanted to say that the influence of the Lexicon project goes very much on with work that Mark and I are doing on propositional attitude verbs. I think we've maybe corresponded a little about this, in that we're also looking at a domain, and particularly in the language we're looking at right now, where there is a much more impoverished set of propositional attitude verbs and a method for getting all the various propositional attitude statements by the combination of certain kinds of clausal complement with the verb. It distinguishes the meanings. But it's the same impulse from this project of looking carefully at the lexicon to try and find the principles, because kids know in languages with very different inventories of clausal types which things go with which. It's not something that you see instructed anywhere. And people have very strong intuitions about which go with which, so that's got to follow from something deep, right? And of course, either that or David's going to say something horrible, I know. All right, so just briefly then, the influence of this project goes on. The kind of investigation we're doing for these is very much like what you're trying to do here, so draw out those principles that determine the argument realization, and a lot of the influence on our project come directly from this lexicon project and from your work too.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay? All right. I'm just too tall for this. Okay, thank you. It's an honor to be speaking here today. So there will be a historical part to this talk, as we were asked by the organizers. As to the lexicon-syntax interface, I'm still puzzled about that. I think there are two fundamental issues that lurk behind this talk about that interface, but they were not, to be honest, at my consciousness when I prepared the presentation, but I will point them out, I hope, as we go along. And the introduction is as follows. First, I should say that the handout is too long and I'm going to skip parts, and I apologize, so I hope you will be able to consult it later. The idea that the unitary appearance of obligatory control into complement clauses conceals an underlying duality of structure and mechanism has a long history in generative grammar, starting from the earliest work. Another idea with a long history is that that complement clauses and non-complement clauses fall under different types of control, commonly called obligatory and non-obligatory control. These two ideas are distinct, even if their genealogies are sometimes confusingly entangled. And this talk is about the first idea, the duality of OC, or obligatory control. So there will be a brief or not so brief journey through the history of that idea, and then some new thoughts on why it is right with some new data, and a proposal on how to deal with that, but really rather sketchy one. Starting with the earliest work, Rosenbaum. So Rosenbaum distinguished VP complements from NP complements, and the empirical basis for that distinction were contrasts like 1C and D, where you could passivize and pseudocleft certain complements, but not others, and the idea was that only those dominated by an NP node could undergo this process, so there was an NP over S analysis over there, and a subtype of the NP complements were oblique complements, as you see on top of page 2, where prepositions surfaced in those contexts. And surprisingly, maybe to current or modern readers of the literature, Rosenbaum was not concerned at all with the question of obligatory coreference. So the split between VP and NP complements only partially predicted whether the embedded subject must be controlled or not. In NP complements, you got optional coreference, so verbs like prefer and hate, which could take lexical subject in the infinitive. And obligatory coreference was observed with VP and PP complements. So the contrast between VP versus NP-PP was did not carry over to the coreference issue. And Rosenbaum really said that there may well be an explanation for the necessary identity of erasing and erased noun phrases in the structures just presented, but this issue will not be taken up in the present study. So he actually didn't raise the question of what explains or what accounts for obligatory control. That was only later became a major issue. And here's a brief message from the future in 3. His dichotomy between the VP complements and the rest really prefigures the modern cut between tensed and untensed complements, which is a crucial predictor of control type, in two senses. In those languages that have infinitival control, you get the contrast between exhaustive and partial control. In those languages that have only subjunctive complements in control context, you get obligatory versus non-obligatory control, depending on the tense factor. So if you look at Rosenbaum's classification, his class of intransitive VP complements verb were begin, cease, commence, condescend, continue, and so on. And these are exactly the spectral and implicative verbs. In contrast, the distinction between complements that can take a disjoint lexical subject versus those that can't proved to be peripheral to a genuine understanding of control mechanisms. Unfortunately, dominated and biased, I think, the literature up until the 90s, due to the focus on the English particular construction of 4NP to VP. So I'm going to take you through a very sort of speedy journey in that literature of the 80s, starting actually with Chomsky and Lasnik, 77, where the duality of obligatory control was conceived in terms of obligatory control versus reflexive deletion. So things like 4AB, predicates that take WH complements, or certain verbs that only allow a null subject in their complement, versus CDE, one type complements where the control effect comes about from a reflexive deletion followed by a complementizer deletion. Those were two different mechanisms, but again, they were based on the 4NP to VP availability, which is English specific. Williams, building on the same distinction, proposed that distinction between obligatory and non-obligatory control. You see 5A versus 5B. The properties of obligatory control were supposed to follow from predication. So you see the 4 properties at the bottom of page 3. And the most commonly observed problems with that system again, other than English specificity, is the fact that the OC properties do not cluster. So C command is forced even in split control. Control can be both obligatory and implicit. Pro-DP alternations exist, and true non-obligatory control is really a very different phenomenon from what you see in want complements. Bresnan LFG account or framework actually incorporated Williams's empirical distinctions within a different theory. So the distinction between functional versus anaphoric control was also underlying a duality of mechanism in obligatory control complements. Functional control is a situation that you have where the controller and controllee share a single value at F structure. The prototype of that is actually raising, not control. And anaphoric control is what you find if the F values of the controller and controllee are distinct but co-indexed, and the prototype is non-obligatory control. So what about obligatory control? They split between those two types. Some of them show functional control, others show anaphoric. Empirically, the split is built on Williams's distinction. You see that in A and B, so promise versus signal, for example. So other problems, again, other than carrying over all the empirical issues with the clustering of criteria that we saw in Williams's theory, something that was not really noted at the time is that really a subclass of control complements is reduced to raising. So this is the structure sharing idea, and as some of you may know, the debate between the movement theory of control and its opponents revolved exactly around that. Are there really control complements that show the profile of raising? So the same critique applies to the functional control analysis in LFG. And as you see in the bottom of page 7, there's a number of other theories that posited a split in the obligatory control structures. So this is a very old idea. Turning to my own ideas from about a decade ago that were sort of subsequently developed in later works, I assume that the split has two faces to that. One is tense versus untense complements. The other one is the target of control. Do you control pro or do you control some agar features on the complementizer? And there was this correlation. So with untense complements, you only got pro control. With tense complements, you only got agar control. And I should say right away that I was much more attached to the tense distinction than to the agree distinction. So I still think that the tense-untense distinction is fundamental, having studied other languages since then. But I was never really satisfied with the technical distinction between agree of pro and agree with C. So I'm going to get rid of one of them, and that's going to be the proposal in the end. You see the two distinctions of relevance in 8a and 8b. So verbs like plan can take tense complements. And when I say tense here, really, I don't want to argue with semanticists that would insist on calling it modality. That's just fine for me. So plan takes a future-oriented or e-realis complements. Manage, which is an implicative verb, it does not allow that kind of temporal mismatch. And the same contrast between the verbs shows up in obligatory partial versus exhaustive control in 8b. In subjunctive languages, that's the comment that I made before, you don't get really partial control, but you do get no control. In tense complements, you get no control at all. So a sample of EC predicates or exhaustive control predicates, I'm just going to call them EC predicates from now on, are implicatives, aspectual, modal, and evaluatives. A sample of PC predicates are factive, propositional, desiderative, and interrogative. And just to summarize and give you a look ahead of what's coming up next, it's clear that OC embraces two types of grammatical dependencies. It's also likely that the right cut is key to the semantic tense distinction and not to whether or not the complement can host a lexical subject. And it's also likely that the technical distinction between pro control and C control is a placeholder for a deeper explanation. So let us take some steps towards a deeper explanation. The basic picture I would like to pursue in 12 is that there is only one type of control, namely the C control type, so some agree relation established between a matrix element and C. There is no such thing as pro control. C control, furthermore, is not just a technical operation, it's really binding of logophoric features in C, speaker, author, and addressee, packaged with tense binding, so this is also what you find in discussions of dependent tense. And what about what used to be called pro control in my system? Well, these are just the good old-fashioned predicative control analysis of Williams, for example. They're construed by predication, and that means that they involve either bare TPs, that is smaller size complements, or degenerate CPs. That's one point of contact, I think, with the topic of this session, which is how do we know which complement meanings are mapped to TPs or to degenerate CPs, and which ones are mapped to full-fledged CPs. That has to do with that interface. And all I'm saying now is really a synthesis and extension of ideas developed earlier by Wurmbrand, Bianchi, Sigurdsson, and Kratzer. So the challenge that is right now facing us is to make a convincing case that EC and PC fall under different mechanisms, even more different than previously envisaged. And one empirical contrast is, of course, already given by the labels, the toleration of exhaustive versus partial control. But we really need an independent criterion that can tell us something about the mechanisms. And I think the criterion is going to be something that wasn't really tested very much before, the visibility of implicit arguments as controllers. So the new claim that you see in 14 is that the controller with EC verbs must be explicit, but the controller with PC verbs must be implicit. Okay, and just a general introductory sort of background comment about that. There are much fewer EC verbs than PC verbs. And the fact that 14b is well known, a vast literature on implicit control has established it beyond doubt. What has gone unnoticed is that EC verbs are a systematic exception in not tolerating that. And let me show you this in two domains. One of them is subject control verbs, and the other one is object control verbs. In both cases, we're going to see that EC verbs do not allow the controller to become implicit, either by passivization of a subject control verb or by object drop of an object control verb. So the standard statement of the so-called Wieser's generalization is given to you in 15. Subject control verbs do not passivize. Evidence, you see top of page 8. You can say John was persuaded to leave, but not John was promised to leave, where the intended promiser is the one to leave. There is a huge literature on that. I won't go through that literature. All those accounts took that contrast to be a fundamental fact that provides a window into the very way control is represented in the grammar, but unfortunately, VG is false. Okay, this is something that I pointed out in my thesis, taken up rather recently by Koppe van Urk in work, a student here at MIT, recent work. So one observation is that impersonal passives are acceptable, always. So you get implicit agent control with impersonal passives. The few impersonal passives that you find in English, 16a, the many more impersonal passives that you find in German and Dutch, even with verbs like promise, they're all good. You also get implicit agent control into adjuncts, as you see at the bottom of the page, in 8. So the true VG, or the RVG, the revised VG, as Koppe proposed, is that implicit subject cannot control, but only if T agrees with a referential DP, that is, with personal, not with impersonal passives. That's an interesting generalization that I won't have time to explain right now. But the new observation that I want to add to that picture right now is that there is a subclass of subject control verbs that do not even allow impersonal passives. So they go beyond the coverage of the RVG. And strikingly, that's the same subclass that disallows partial control. That's the EC class, or spectral and implicative class verbs. Okay, you can't really test modals because they don't passivize. So take a look at some facts. In Hebrew, active counterparts of all those sentences are good. The impersonal passives in 19a are PC verbs, decide and plan, they're good, but the EC verbs in 19b are bad. German examples are not judged wholly ungrammatical, but the examples with the PC verbs are just perfect, and Dutch ungrammatical examples in 21, these are all EC verbs, so either implicative or spectral verbs. Extending the picture to object control verbs. How much time do I have? Okay. So extending the picture to object control verbs, the prediction is that you would not be able to drop the object in exhaustive control object control verbs. What are the relevant candidates? Those are implicative verbs of manipulation like force, compel, coerce, that all entail their complements as implicative verbs do. There are not too many of them, and furthermore, you have to be sure that you're not looking at a language that abhors object drop to begin with, like English, so English is not very informative. And the contrast that you're looking for is between verbs like persuade, ask, that take irrealis complements, and force verbs that take implicative complements. And even further than that, you have to put aside object pro because that would count as a syntactic controller. So there are many kind of methodological problems with testing that prediction. Once you are able to test it, maybe you can actually sort of save the core of the so-called Bach's generalization. Bach's generalization said that object-controlled verbs do not detransitivize. For the most part, it's false, but I think there's a kernel of truth in that if you look at the right context. So here are some examples. In 23, from a dissertation on Polish, Slodowicz reports that controller DPs can be freely dropped in the language except with implicative verbs, and you get very minimal pairs as controlled by the contribution of aspects. So you take the verb persuade in the perfective, it's implicative. In the imperfective, it's non-implicative. That is, implicative meaning entailing that the one being persuaded actually carried out the action that he was persuaded of. So you get the contrast in 23 versus A versus B. The gap position in the example indicates to you where the dropped object is, and the imperfective one, the non-implicative one, allows object drop. The note that I have below here, knowing nothing about Polish, I hope that this is not just an artifact of the perfective-imperfective contrast, but I don't have relevant data. I mean, I hope that this was tested. Turning to here, you might now say that worry that there is something about the fact that direct objects don't really like to be dropped, and that's true. Cross-linguistically, oblique complements are much more easily omissible. But fortunately, Hebrew also provides some minimal comparisons. We have 8 object-control verbs that all take the oblique controller of the form on DP, the preposition al in Hebrew. 4 of them are implicatives, 4 are desiderative, and what you find, top of page 12 now, that is all the implicative verbs resist controller drop. And out of the non-implicative ones, only 1 resists it. This one does not really jeopardize our generalization because while we derive the obligatoriness of implicative controllers, we have nothing to say about the optionality of desiderative controllers. That could be sort of affected by lexical properties or things that we don't really understand. But the prediction is that implicative controllers would never drop. So you see the contrast in 25, A versus B. You cannot say, Gil coerced to quit yesterday, but you can say made it easy, commanded, and so on. So returning to why is all this important, 26 now, the unavailability of implicit control with easy verbs is so striking because it's the exception, also in Hebrew. It's not the norm. Every other type of control construction, PC complements, adjunct, or subject clauses, allows implicit control. It's been documented very widely. You see some examples on the top of page 13. And that really tells me that the type of control that is involved with EC predicates is quite different. So returning to the basic picture in 27C and D suggest that EC complements are construed by syntactic predication. And what do we know about syntactic predication? Well, one thing that we know is that the argumented predicated of must be syntactically represented. This is 28. So these are classical examples. You cannot say the room was left angry at the guests, John ate raw, and so on. To the extent that you can either drop or make some argument implicit, it cannot saturate a syntactic predicate. That's exactly what we find with EC predicates. And I think this is the sort of the core of truth in Williams's classical analysis, which is true for this subclass of predicates. What about PC control? Well, that's quite a different story. I think what's going on there is some sort of logophoric anchoring. So I'm 29 now. Attitude verbs induce a logophoric center. That's a term from Bianchi's work on the selected comp. What does this center consist of? It consists of minimally 3 coordinates: the speaker of the matrix, the addressee, and the tense. And embedded arguments and tense may or must be bound by these coordinates. So in PC control complements, for example, pro is necessarily anaphoric to either the speaker or the addressee, and the tense of the non-finite complement is anchored to the matrix tense. So some words about the syntax and the semantics of that type of control, really quite sketchily. The syntax in 30, where does this logophoric center resides? I assume it resides in the fin head, or so the lowest head in the CP periphery. We can treat the speaker and the addressee coordinates as just person features, first and second features. What is pro under this analysis? It's just a minimal pronoun. It's just a numerical index in the sense of Kratzer 2009. In any given control sentence, either the speaker or addressee is activated. Rarely both are activated via a sum operator, and that gives us split control. The semantics in 32, the person features on C are interpreted as indexical lambda operators or context shifters as suggested in recent work by Anand, Nevins, Cable, Schlenker, and Kratzer. So control CPs are interpreted as perspectival properties, properties predicated from the perspective of first or second person. For example, rather informally, John hopes to win is true if and only if in every context of which John is an author and is compatible with what he hopes at the time and world of utterance, he has the property of winning. And that, of course, looks like Kirke's theory of control with the important proviso that the controller choice is modeled on direct discourse counterparts, that is Kuhnel's old insight, and not by any theta hierarchy. And if you wonder now, so how come implicit arguments can control where that's not predication in the syntax, that's a lexical entailment, it can access implicit arguments. A second note, maybe problem, is that personal agreement with the controller must override or ignore the first and second features in Finn, but probably or possibly not so in logophoric languages like Amharic that have shifted indexicals. That's a well-known issue, and there are various ways to tackle it. My own favorite option is to restrict the agreement relation that takes care of those features to the PF component and allow the semantic component to just see the first and second features. But that's an open problem. And since I know that in this audience, some people are sitting that know more about this, like Irena and Philippe, I better stop before I say anything foolish. And this is still under work. So thank you.
Assumption that implicit arguments don't license secondary predicates. That this account is sort of based on, at least the data you discussed today. So I don't think that things like, so I think examples like these control verbs were discussed stoned, or all of these articles were once read.
Can you say that again?
These control verbs were discussed stoned, or all of these articles were once read naked. That doesn't seem that bad to me. And I think this was noted, I think, originally by Ken Sapphire in work on implicit arguments and secondary predicates. And I think I don't think there is a real account of why it's not really understood why there's a difference here.
So this is an old debate. I think in the 80s, I think Roper was the one that was insisting on the fact, on the claim that implicit arguments can saturate predicates, but funnily, all the examples had naked in them. So, and those that don't were rather under dispute. I remember Sapphire's discussion from NPs. So he had examples like discussion of those issues stoned, and that's not a problem because there is a null subject in the NP. As to the examples of bare predicates, there are some proposals that, some of them can modify events to the extent that you can, and my experience with Speaker is the moment you expand those predicates, you get angry at the guests, mad at somebody. So the moment you expand them, you do not allow the adverbial option, they become even worse. And they're certainly very bad with object drop, John H. Raw. So maybe there's something special about implicit agents that I don't fully understand, but I think the general tendency is in direction that is I'm describing here.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Jackendoff from Tufts University.
Thank you very much. It's really a deep honor to have been chosen to speak on this awesome occasion out of so many distinguished graduates of the MIT program. You know, looking back, I can look farther back than even the previous speakers, but there are people who can look back further than me. It seems to me that generative grammar originated and has continued to thrive thanks to the combination of two themes, Mendelism and formalism. And over the years, the Mendelism has remained a rock, I think, but the formalism has undergone many sea changes. I've always felt myself that Mendelism is the more important of these two commitments. I've always felt that the formal technology, including the overall architecture of the grammar, should support integrating the theory of language with theories of other cognitive capacities insofar as we can determine how to do this. In the last 15 years, in keeping with trying to deal with the Mendelism, with psychological reality, I found myself taking the term knowledge of language very seriously. Knowledge implies something stored in memory, so I've recast the major questions of generative grammar as in one on the handout. First, what linguistic units and linguistic complexes do speakers of a particular language store in their long-term memory? And the standard answer, of course, is the lexicon, the words and or morphemes of the language. Second, what procedures do speakers use to construct novel composite structures? And the standard answer is the grammar, the combinatorial rules of the language. Third, what procedures do language learners use to construct the first two kinds of knowledge? And the standard answer is universal grammar and or the language acquisition device. Now, of course, the rules of the grammar, just like the words and morphemes, have to be stored in long-term memory in some form or another. And like the words and morphemes, the rules that differ from language to language have to be acquired. But from the outset, generative grammar inherited from traditional grammar an assumption that the lexicon and the grammar are fundamentally different kinds of mental representations. We might want to say the lexicon and the grammar are stored differently in the brain, whatever that might mean. I want to show that there are benefits to giving up this assumption and that there's really nothing to lose aside from tradition. The argument goes by a sort of slippery slope. There are things you have to store in the lexicon that are progressively more and more rule-like, so there seems less and less reason to distinguish them from things that everyone accepts as rules. So where do you draw the line between words and rules? And I'm going to argue that you don't have to. When you get to the bottom of the slippery slope, you discover it's not so bad down there after all. And I should mention that versions of this argument have been made by HPSG, cognitive grammar, and construction grammar. Okay, so to start, let's think about what a word is. In anybody's theory, it's an association of a piece of composite phonology, say cat, a piece of composite semantics, say feline and pet and so forth, and some morphosyntactic features like plus n, minus v, and in a gendered language, say masculine, as in two. And in a mentalist theory, we take this association of these three structures to be instantiated in long-term memory somehow or another. Now, not all words have features in all three of these domains. So words like the ones in 3, things like hello and ouch, have phonology and semantics, but no detectable syntax. They can occur alone as full utterances, and they occur in combination only paratactically, as in 4a, and in quotative context, as in 4b and c, where you can insert anything at all, even a phrase of another language. A few words of English shown in 5 have phonological and syntactic features, but no semantic features. They just function as grammatical glue. If you believe in big pro and or little pro, these are items that have syntax and semantics, but no phonology. And finally, nonsense words like the ones in 7 have phonology, but no syntax or semantics. Their linguistic function is to just fill up metrical space in poetry or songs. If you know the song, you recognize these the same way you recognize words. So now I want to ask, what else do you have to store? Well, for one thing, you obviously have to store idioms in some form or another, either by listing them in their entirety or by establishing pointers to their parts or something else. For example, kick the bucket has a phonological structure, plus a semantic structure approximately equivalent to die, plus the syntactic structure of a VP, as shown in 8. And we know it's a VP because kick inflects just like an ordinary verb. And idioms can have argument structures. So the ones in 9 take a freely chosen direct object, just like ordinary transitive verbs take someone for granted. As has been observed many times, many and maybe most idioms have canonical syntactic structure, but some don't, like the ones in 10, things like day in, day out. And you should notice, by the way, that the idioms in 10b serve as full utterances, and they don't embed except in quotative context, as you'll see in 11. So you can't say, I wondered whether, how about lunch. There's another class of idioms that I call constructional idioms that use canonical syntax but to unusual semantic ends. And 12 gives 3 examples. The way construction, Bill belched his way out of the restaurant, for example, where belch doesn't normally subcategorize a verb phrase like that. For each of these, you have to store something about its syntactic structure, something about how its constituents correspond to semantics in other than the normal way, and something about the phonology of the designated elements, way, away, and off, that signal something unusual is going on. There are other constructions of this sort, like the ones in 13, that don't have any distinguishing phonological content, so they're not very word-like at all. So the first one is the sound plus motion construction. The trolley rumbled around the corner, which was studied, I think, first by Levin and Rappaport. For all of these constructions, you have to store your knowledge of them as some sort of an association between a syntactic structure and a semantic complex. But the basic formalism is the same for words, except that the syntax, like the phonology and semantics, is composite. It's not just a couple of category features. And in the case of 13, the ones in 13, there's no phonology. And people in construction grammar have written about lots of constructions like 12 and 13, and of course I have too. The language is full of them. Now, at this point, I hear people objecting, well, this is all part of the periphery of language. I'm really only interested in, or even linguistic theory should only be interested in, the core fundamental phenomena. And I disagree. You're welcome to pursue your own interest, but my question is, what do you store in long-term memory? And these phenomena have to be part of the answer. The theory of sentence structure has to account for how this stuff gets built into utterances, and the learning theory has to account for how the child acquires it. Well, okay, but now these phenomena raise an interesting problem. There ought to be a distinction between the idioms and constructions that are syntactically canonical, like 9 and 12, and the ones that aren't, like 10. In some sense, the canonical ones ought to cost less. Maybe they should be easier to learn, or easier to store, or easier to process. And how should the theory reflect this difference? Well, the standard way to create syntactically composite expressions, like, say, throw the shovel, as opposed to kick the bucket, is to use rules of grammar that apply to lexical items in order to build phrases that aren't lexical items. And this is true whether the rules of grammar are phrase structure rules or merge. But for idioms, which are syntactically composite expressions within the lexicon, we're faced with a sort of ordering paradox. We can only state the generalization in the lexicon in terms of rules that apply outside or after the lexicon. Well, to see how to get around this problem, let's take a look at another area where generative grammar has been, let's say, uncomfortable over the years, namely morphology. In the earliest treatments, like Lisa's Grammar of English Nominalizations, now there's a name to conjure with, morphological structure was derived by means of transformations. The problem with this approach is that transformations are supposed to be productive and general, but a lot of morphology isn't. So here are 3 symptoms. First of all, in many cases, although evidently there's a rule involved, you still have to list the instances of the rule individually. Your knowledge of English has to include recital and recitation, but it had better exclude incital and incitation. Similarly, it has to include confusion and refusal, but not refusion and confusal. Second symptom, there are often, quote, derived items without a root, things like ambition, ablution, and retribution. So what do you derive them from? Third symptom is that the meanings of so-called derived items are often, maybe usually, partly idiosyncratic with respect to the meaning of the root. So you can't generate them with a general meaning-blind transformation. Think, for instance, of the difference between the meanings of recite, recitation, and recital. So I'll use the term semi-productive for rules with some combination of these 3 symptoms. Now, one proposed solution to semi-productivity was Lakoff's system of exception features in his thesis and his book Irregularity in Syntax. And this did solve the first and second problems by brute force, but he solved them. And it incidentally paved the way for generative semantics. But it didn't solve the third problem, as Chomsky pointed out with great force in Remarks on Nominalization. Chomsky's solution was to put semi-productive morphology in the lexicon prior to lexical insertion. At the time, the realization of this proposal in the air was that regularities in the lexicon are accounted for by lexical redundancy rules, which are supposed to be distinct from rules of phrasal grammar. They're somehow in the lexicon. And later developments such as LFG and HPSG took this distinction between lexical and phrasal rules as foundational, and so did many approaches to morphology. Some of these formulations treat lexical redundancy rules as derivational, for example, deriving recital from recite, which again doesn't solve the problem of semantic idiosyncrasy. In other formulations, including mine in my 1975 paper in Language, lexical redundancy rules were taken to measure the redundancy among fully stored items. Later on, some trends in generative grammar, such as the work of Hale and Kaiser, went back to accounting for morphologically complex items through syntactic operations such as head raising. But I think the derivational mechanism has the same three problems as Lisa's approach, and to my knowledge, these haven't been solved. Also, I never could tell whether Hale and Kaiser's head movement is supposed to take place in the syntax or the lexicon. If it's in the syntax, you end up with the same ordering paradox I described a minute ago for idioms. But if it's in the lexicon, you have to give up the notion that of the lexicon as the place where linguistic units are stored in long-term memory. And that's something that I really would like to preserve as psycholinguistically grounded and hence foundational. Distributed morphology also builds up words in the syntax, and it responds to the parent ordering paradox by inserting words after the syntax. As far as I understand it, the counterpart of the lexicon, of my version of the lexicon, is in distributed morphology is the vocabulary. This is where you list linkings of phonological, syntactic, and semantic structures. I'm not sure how the vocabulary captures the difference between productive, semi-productive, and idiosyncratic phonological and semantic relations among vocabulary entries. In the distributed morphology literature I'm familiar with anyway, this doesn't seem to be a concern, but I'm not familiar with it all, to be sure. An alternative is the current technology in HPSG and construction grammar, as well as in my parallel architecture. This treats lexical rules as nodes in an inheritance hierarchy. That is, they're structural schemas with variables in them, and items in the lexicon can inherit structure from these schemas. For instance, recital inherits structure both from recite and from the D-verbal AL schema, 14a, but it also has idiosyncratic semantic structure of its own. A rootless item like ablution inherits structure from the shun schema, 14b, but since there's no root ablute, it has to pay in some sense for its pseudo-root. In turn, 14a and 14b both inherit structure from the more general nominalization schema, 14c. I think there are a lot of questions about how inheritance hierarchies work, both formally and especially in the brain. But they seem in principle to be the right sort of formal device for capturing lexical regularities. And what's interesting is these schemas can be listed in the lexicon too. They are also pieces of morphophonological and morphosyntactic and maybe semantic structure in association that have to be learned as part of your knowledge of English. Well, but now it gets interesting because the very same format works for productive morphology. So, for instance, 15 is the schema that defines the form of English present participles. And for productive morphology, we hope you don't have to store every form. When there's a new verb like Skype, you automatically know that the present participle is Skyping. So this case looks more like the kind of syntax we grew up loving. It should be in the syntax, not in the lexicon. So what's the difference between 14 and 15? And by the way, the difference between these two kinds of rules was at the heart of the words versus rules controversy raging between the connectionists and Pinker and his crew in the 1980s and 90s. And that's a very long story, which I don't have time for today. going back to the difference between these two, I want to suggest that it's not in where the schema is in the grammar, with one in the lexicon and one in the syntax. Rather, these schemas have exactly the same format, so they should be in the same component. And since 14 can't be in the syntax, 15 has to be in the lexicon. So what I want to propose is that the distinction between 14 and 15 should be made in the character of the variable. One kind of variable, the one in 15, will be marked productive, and that means you can create new forms on the fly from it. The other kind in 14 will be marked semi-productive, and a semi-productive variable can only capture generalizations among listed items. But here's the trick. Productive schemas can also, because they're in the lexicon, they can also serve as ancestors of stored items. For example, the words scissors and trousers pretty obviously are stored, but they still inherit structure from the productive English plural schema. As evidence that this solution is on the right track, take a look at 16, which gives you 4 different principles for naming geographic features in English. Arrowhead Lake, Lake Michigan, the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Fundy. You can use any old name in any of these schemas, so that variable is productive. But which of the 4 schemas you're supposed to use depends on the word for the type of feature, whether it's lake or ocean or mountain or mount. And you have to learn which words go in which schema. So that variable is semi-productive. In other words, these schemas have one variable of each type. This means we can't capture semi-productivity in the lexicon and productivity in the syntax, because the very same rule has both kinds of variables. So they both have to be in the same component. And structural schemas of the type in 16a, where you mark the variable for whether it's productive or not, do the trick. So I want to conclude that the distinction between productivity and semi-productivity is localized not in the type of rule, but in the type of variable. Okay, now let's go back to idioms and constructions. So suppose a language's phrase structure rules are stated as syntactic schemas without any associated phonology or semantics, say like 17, which would be the rule for English transitive verb phrases. Given what we've seen before, there's actually no problem at all situating this in the lexicon. We know we have lexical items with just phonology, items with just phonology and syntax, items with just phonology and semantics, items with lots of structure, and items with lots of variables. So 17 just happens to be an item with only syntax made up entirely of productive variables, just one more logical possibility in the same old system. And because the variables are productive, 17 licenses novel, freely combined VPs in syntax. And at the same time, it can serve as an ancestor in the inheritance hierarchy for all the VP idioms and constructions, even though they have non-canonical semantics. On the other hand, the idioms and constructions with non-canonical syntax don't inherit their structure from anything, and so they have to pay for it themselves. And so this captures, I think, the intuitive difference between the idioms and constructions with canonical versus non-canonical syntax. And it avoids the ordering paradox that arises from keeping the syntax and the lexicon distinct. So we've reached the bottom of the slippery slope, and it actually makes some things work better. Now, 17 is also a descendant of the even more general schema 18. This is a rule of X-bar theory that stipulates head-first order in XP. So learning the head parameter for a language then involves establishing something like 18 in the lexicon. On the other hand, because the variable is semi-productive, 18 allows for other competing schemas just in case different categories have different headedness. Now notice, if we incorporate syntactic rules into the lexicon, like I'm proposing, we have to formulate syntax in terms of licensing conditions, as in HPSG, LFG, and optimality theory, rather than in terms of derivations. In particular, we have to expunge the notion of movement, which is a derivational notion, from the syntactic armamentarium. So this might be very, very startling, and you might ask how a theory like this deals with long-distance dependencies and the like, which have always seemed very natural under a movement hypothesis. Well, again, HPSG and LFG and my parallel architecture and its syntactic component, simpler syntax, are all attempts to work this out, and I can't go through the arguments today. There's a lot of them. But to summarize, within the parallel architecture, now syntax is in the lexicon. Rules of grammar are schemas with productive or semi-productive variables stored in the brain in the very same format as words. They're simply pieces of stored structure. Well, if rules of grammar are in the lexicon, I guess the next thing we have to ask is, how do we do online composition? What builds novel sentences from lexical entries? All the constraint-based approaches use unification as this operation, which is a good deal more flexible than merge. In particular, merge just combines two entities into a set, so in some sense it's simpler, but unification can combine structures in overlapping fashion. And as I've discussed in my recent article in Language, this flexibility leads to advantages in a wide range of situations all over the grammar, as well as in the relationship of grammar to other cognitive capacities. And you can state unification either declaratively, which gives you a competence theory that says what sentences are licensed by the grammar, or you can state it procedurally, so you can use it to describe language processing. So a grammar of this sort can serve either as a model of competence or of performance, and I take this to be really important if we're trying to explain how language is incorporated into the brain. Now, Noam has occasionally conjectured that all differences among languages are encoded in the lexicon, and that there's only one universal combinatorial rule. The picture of grammar I've been drawing actually has this property, since everything that was previously called a rule of grammar is now a lexical item. And indeed, we're left with exactly one combinatorial rule left, only it's not merge, it's unification. Thank you.
Specific questions, I would ask the three speakers to come up front to the table, and we'll open it up for a general discussion of all three talks. We have until 11:45, so that's 20 minutes now for a general discussion.
Martin, was there one question?
Oh, I didn't see that.
Hello. Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Peter Graff. I'm a student here in the department. So I want to raise just two phenomena briefly, and then finish up with a question. So first of all, the very same affix in different environments, specifically the affix idi, exhibits very, very different patterns of productivity. So if I give somebody the word fnarkable, then people will prefer to say fnarkability. But if I say fnarkiv, then people will prefer to say fnarkivness rather than fnarkivivity, I guess. That's the one phenomenon. The second phenomenon is the fact that when you look at idioms cross-linguistically and also in English, you find a lot of idioms that have a sort of subject slot, but you don't find a lot of idioms that have an object slot, a variable in the object place. Now, I'm sure that you have particular rules or particular structural descriptions of different lexical items that would handle these phenomena, but what I guess I'm wondering about is how you deal with the fact, whether we want to spend a lot of time formalizing particular ways of writing down these representations, or whether what we should actually be wondering about is how people actually learn the particular patterns in their language from the distributional evidence that they're given. So I'm wondering whether you have something to say about that.
Well, the general question, I think formalism matters. You want to choose a formalism that gives you the right degrees of freedom, that doesn't force you to do all kinds of gymnastics to capture the phenomena that seem very natural. So I think we should want a formalism that gives us the right kinds of flexibility. I think you're quite right in morphology, but also in syntax. There are the very same or the very same or almost the very same pattern can be productive in one context and semi-productive in another, and you'll find combinations, and you'll find within a semi-productive domain, you'll find subdomains that are productive. So the one I think I've noticed is in the D nominal verbs like butter the bread and so forth, which are certainly semi-productive because you don't have mayonnaise and mustard the bread, except in the context of maybe recipes now and then. But in the context of fasteners, anything goes. I think it's perfectly productive. And in the communication verbs like Skype, anything goes. So to find a productive sub-pattern within a semi-productive larger pattern is not a surprise. And I think that can be stated in the context of inheritance hierarchies and the marking of variables as productive or semi-productive. I think that probably productive is the marked case because at least our assumptions about learning are that you learn a few instances first, then you draw generalization among those, and then in learning you decide, oh, this is productive, and now you start making up new instances. And again, this formalism allows you to at least say that. It puts productivity and semi-productivity in the same bin rather than putting one in the syntax and one in the lexicon.
So but how does this go beyond the notational convention?
It's not a notational convention. It's the architecture of the grammar, right? It's saying, here are the components of the grammar. Here's how they are related to one another. And that's really important, right? It's different from saying, well, we just have a rule that combines things and then a lot of conditions, you know. It's saying, here are the things you can combine. Here's where these things are located. Here's how sentences are built. Here's a performance model that's based on this notation, and so on. That's not trivial. I thought that's what they all taught us at MIT.
I want to move on to the general discussion, but maybe this can be the first question for the general discussion. So I'll ask Idan and Beth to join us.
Yeah, this is definitely the first question of the general discussion. So, Mark Baker from Rutgers University. It is occasioned by Ray's paper, but I think it's an issue for everybody and all of us, and it is the question of, well, what do we do about semi-productivity? We do know how to list things. We do know how to compose things. The semi-productive, I think, is a challenging case that front and center in lexical knowledge and morphology both. A little challenge for Ray would be, I don't know if on the bottom of page 5, if you say that a variable is semi-productive, capturing generalizations among listed items, I don't actually know what that says exactly. I know what it's hoping to say or so on, but what's the sort of added value of capturing generalizations if you've had to list them anyway, sort of? And then that could come up, we could broaden that out a little bit for Beth and Idan. Again, it seems to me like many of the phenomenon, say with hit verbs and so on, are sort of semi-productive. We say there's a class or lexical parameters, but say one language has a few manner-oriented verbs too, another has a few path-oriented verbs too. Idan mentioned in the discussion that, well, maybe there are some differences between, say, naked and so on. What do we do? I think this question of what we do with the semi-productivity is an issue for all.
This was actually the issue in my 1975 paper. I mean, the standard way of doing it was say, well, if you have a generalization in a lexical redundancy rule, you don't have to list it in the lexical item. And what I showed was that you couldn't really bring that off, that you wanted to say everything is listed, but in some sense having the rule is reducing the cost. And I still am not sure what that means. People are talking now in terms of the entropy of the lexicon or something like that. That is, or the internal coherence of the lexicon by virtue of having rules that capture regularities. And I think it's a real puzzle how to work that out. And if we learn about it, I think we'll know something about the structure of human memory in general, and it won't pertain just to linguistics. That would be the hope. So think about your memory for tunes, for example. It's much harder to remember a tune that's not sort of tonal and has the expected rhythm. Well, where are those regularities represented? It's not like you're generating the tune by reconstituting it from some fragments plus applying the rules to it. But somehow the tune is easier to learn, easier to remember, easier to recover. I don't know what the mechanisms are for that, and I'm hoping that if we come up with a reasonable theory of this for the lexicon, it will also apply across the board, and we can start talking to people who actually work on memory and learn something about the brain from it.
I think for me, it's still a puzzle as this question applies to verbs. I mean, I'm more and more aware that even if I talk about big classes like hitting verbs, there are differences among individual hitting verbs that I totally glossed over. But exactly, what the sources are, I mean, I would love to see them and to some extent in the lexical item or the individual meaning of the verbs themselves, I think, but to actually see how far you could even take that idea and to what extent there is some residue of idiosyncrasy, I don't really have a good answer to, but I think delving into the minutiae of some of these classes would be worth doing.
Yeah, I'm Tom Bever. At least I was when I came in. Okay, Ray. The question is not where the productive system might be. The question is, what is it? And it seems to me that what is taken to be formal syntax or the class of syntactic theories are attempts to address that question. So the young gentleman, I think, asked the right question, which is whether, with respect to that question, what you've proposed is a notational variant on some other syntactic theories, or whether it has some property as a syntactic theory that follows from where you claim it to be located.
Well, two levels of reply. One is to say what I'm focusing on is this duality between productive and semi-productive, which the syntactic theory has always been very, very uneasy about. And I want to say the very same rule could be semi-productive or productive. So the case that convinced me of this was the preposition noun construction, day to day, day after day, day by day, which is productive with the preposition, there are all these little idioms like this, hand over fist and so on. Then there are 5 prepositions that are sort of productive, by, after, to, I forget what the other 2 are. But within those, after is very productive. To is only semi-productive in some of its meaning. So you have head to head, you have cheek to cheek only in the context of dancing, you have side to side, which has the wrong meaning, you have hand to hand, which is only in the case of combat, you don't have foot to foot, you do have toe to toe. So it's a semi-productive construction that has exactly the same syntax as the syntax of day after day. Okay, so I want to say these are in exactly the same have exactly the same formal structure, and the only difference has to be something about the way the variable is specified. That's really new in linguistic theory, I think. I think that's really different because we haven't, as I said in the talk, first semi-productivity was exception features. Then it was shoved off into the lexicon, and then it was ignored when people came back to doing it in terms of syntax. So I think this really is different. It's not a notational variant. It forces you to see syntax as composed of lexical items as opposed to being a completely different component. And I think that's if you don't think that's important, I don't understand what your view of syntactic theory is.
Well, still on? I'll take the last statement and respond quoting Roman Jakobson. That is a most interesting personal remark. At any rate, what you can't understand. But it still seems to me that what you're claiming in terms of the structure, I insist on making the distinction between what's being claimed about the structure and where it is, metaphorically. There's one set of lexical items that are productive, that is to say, whatever the syntactic rules are of the language or apply to them in some general way. And then there's another set of phrases, lexical items, idioms, and so on, each of which has an idiosyncratic property. But there's no, by virtue of what you've said, there's no systematicity there. You simply have to know for a particular idiom, particular lexical item or phrase, what its idiosyncratic properties are. But you don't have to know that for the system that's productive. So it still seems to me that the study of the productive system, which has sometimes been called syntax or core syntax, still presents the puzzles that are the profound ones, like a puzzle for acquisition, puzzle for a neurological organization and construction, and so on.
Well, I think that actually the same problems arise for semi-productive ones. That is, how do you learn that? I think there's a major puzzle. How do you learn that n to n is semi-productive, but n after n is productive? I should also mention that this gives interesting consequences for a processing theory because it says that syntactic priming is just like lexical priming. And as far as I can tell from the literature, that's more or less the case. When syntactic priming was discovered, they said this is really weird because it has to do with rules rather than lexical items. Now, for me, I can say they're really two versions of the same phenomenon. That's kind of cool. I think incorporating semi-productivity now gives us a purchase on morphology that we didn't have. It gives us a purchase on idioms that we didn't have. It gives us a purchase on strange constructions that we didn't have. So I think it's really a different story. It's not a notational variant of anything that I know of.
Okay, well, I guess we're all piling on Ray. Gee, Bob Berwick. So, Ray, I want to know exactly what version of unification you've bought, because you could have bought a cheap version, but if you've bought the LFG or the HPSG version, you've bought something very, very expensive. So I want to know whether you've really gone to Walmart or not. That's what I want to know.
I'm not, I have to say, I'm not very particular yet about what version of unification I want.
But see, it matters. That's
well,
why
I know it matters, and I want to get it right, but that depends on finding out some property of how it works. So, for example, I think in some cases you need a version of soft unification, which is sort of like OT. So,
well, let me give you the exact example. So if you have some kind of unification, that, as in F structures or in HPSG, where you can go down some arbitrary number of hierarchical structures, then match them up, then that's very, very, very expensive. We only have exponential time algorithms for that, and there's no way out of it. So nothing in and of the formalism will give you something about efficient parsability. And so if they've never been able to answer that, that goes back to the stuff that I did with Amy in '84, and there's been no answer to that. So you don't want to buy that version. But if you've got something that's just flat, like the checking of 5 features with merge, so it's just feature value checking, that's cheap. That's linear time. So you got to be careful. That's my question.
That's fine. I think that depends on working out the cases that you need to do. And certainly in the case of building semantic structures, from overlapping syntactic constructions, there's some interesting puzzles to work out, and I haven't done it. I see how it should work, but I don't have a formalization of that. I think you're quite right. It's important to establish how it works, but it seems like it has the right properties in a way that just composing two things in a set doesn't.
Is that on? Yeah, William Snyder, University of Connecticut. And just a very quick thought, maybe not worth much, but I've been interested in children's acquisition of compounding as what we call a fully productive process in English, say, versus as a process of something more like conscious coinage in most of the Romance languages. And this notion of conscious coinage strikes me as similar in some ways to what's being called semi-productivity here. So basically, so there's the fully creative compounding in English. We make up new compounds, recursive compounds, and we expect other people to understand them in context. Then within the stored lexicalized compounds, man, frog in French, this kind of thing, or more to the point, something like mode revue mode, fashion magazine. It seems that what people might be doing is inventing new compounds as conscious coinages when necessary, but drawing on models of ones they already have. And I wonder if that could be part of this picture.
I think that's more or less the distinction between productive and semi-productive. So if I say, would you mustard the bread for me? You'll understand it, but you'll sort of go, oh, you'll get this little affect that goes with it. And so when you have a semi-productive process, you can always invent new ones, but typically people notice it. I haven't done a serious study of this, or you'll find different people accept different ones. You didn't even know, so you send out a paper for review and someone says, I don't get any of these examples, right? This is what I have with the day-to-day stuff, or what about this one? You say it's bad, I say it's good. So you get a lot of individual variation. It's the particular ones you happen to have learned.
Bruce Hayes, UCLA. Sorry? Oh, were you pointing behind me? I'm sorry. I was handed the microphone, so I thought... I took that as an invitation to speak. So I have a question that's directed at both Ray and Beth, and it concerns, again, productivity. What I take to be one of the really central mysteries, unsolved problems in linguistics, is the cause of productivity, right? It's a learnability problem, and it's a tough learnability problem because of the no negative evidence, as Ray pointed out, the no negative evidence issue. You hear a bunch of examples of a construction that is not productive, and you have to avoid the fatal mistake of not overgeneralizing. Now, in the past decade or so, a little bit of progress seems to have been made on this in the traditional area where people worry about productivity, namely word formation, that Hay and Bayan actually have an algorithm that digests the data, makes certain choices, and is able, at least with some accuracy, to predict the productivity of a construction. So my question is, both of you are talking about productivity in a quite different area, namely how a language lexicalizes concepts, and Ray is pushing for the view that even syntactic constructions should have levels of productivity. So what goes on? What does the child take in? How does the child process this to figure out what's productive and what's not?
I think that's a good question, but I don't feel like I'm in a position to address that.
I think that's a fundamental question we have to deal with now. I don't know the answer. People say, well, it's frequency, but I have a case that seems to show it's not frequency, which is this construction I had in the handout. I'm all coffeeed out. That's totally productive. If you've been watching, 3 nights of Bogart movies, you can say I'm Humphrey Bogarted out, right? You hear this construction maybe 3 times a year, right? Right? And you probably don't learn it until you're, 10 or 12. But it's productive. What is it about the input on that particular construction makes it productive? And it might have something to do with the diversity of the examples you hear, in addition to the frequency. I think Adele Goldberg has been working with issues along these lines.
Heidi Harley, University of Arizona. It's interesting that I've worked in distributed morphology, which I want to thank you guys for including a paragraph about it there. And I've often watched the sort of your approach and the HPSG approach kind of grow toward this syntax in the lexicon or syntax in the, what you might call the morphological component, and wondered if we were converging towards a picture, since in the DM side of the world, we're all doing the morphology and the syntax. So we're going to converge to a sort of unimodular architecture in this sense. And this discussion has kind of been revealing to me in that I think it depends, that I wondered if there was a difference between syntax and lexicon and syntax. And I actually think that there is, which is that it depends on what problem you want to buy for your starting problem. So if you're doing DM or related stories, you're starting from a theory that can do unbounded dependencies, and then you're worrying about problems at the top or the bottom end of the slippery slope, instead of the other way around. That is, at the bottom of your slippery slope, there's scope and WH movement, and so you're going to have to say something complicated about those issues. Just to sort of tie that into a question that I wanted to ask Beth, and that you happily had a beautiful example of at the end, in the noun-verb, in the denominal verb constructions, you pointed to the fact that Skype and button are productive instances of denominal verbalization, whereas the sort of location ones are semi-productive. If you're thinking of things in a kind of Hale and Kaiserian way, you might want to tie that to the fact that instruments are typically adjuncts and locations are typically, or locatums anyway, are typically arguments. And that you might want to sort of hang something on that syntactic difference. And so the point being that in the kind of examples that Beth was talking about, you had a lot of the hit plus bare noun ones that were instruments, so hit knife, hit fist, these kind of things. But anyway, so I just was wondering about the particular, you might say, thematic relation that the noun bears with respect to the verb, and its connection to the manner side of things, which is the adjunct side, and the result side of things, which is the argument side. Thanks.
I'm not quite sure exactly what question to extract from that, Heidi, besides that, there is, the manner side of things picks up on things like instruments, and then in denominal verbs, the locatum and locations, you're saying are potentially less productive, but I'm not quite... Yeah, well, I think whether instruments are truly adjuncts is actually something that gets argued, and so depending on where you fall on that argument, and I'm not saying I've got to quite know the answer. In fact, it's not clear whether you can actually hang it at least on an argument adjunct distinction, even if you might hang it on if you want to hang it on a syntactic one, but there are also semantic ones, because locations and locatums have very different enter into very different kinds of semantic relations than instruments do as well. So, I think we need to understand what the phenomena are. And I've been reading recently and reading about these hitting verbs, that they're languages which, I hope I have it right, just don't even have, I think it's the location verbs at all. And I think that's an even bigger mystery.
I think the place where we're really maybe starting differently is you're assuming that syntax is the base of things, and it's an issue about syntax. And I I'm interested in what do you store in long-term memory, and that includes semantics and phonology. And in fact, the semantic and phonological information is generally much richer than the syntactic information stored with a lexical item. So that leads to a view that says you can't study morphology or you can't study syntactic combination without knowing what aspects of that are due to semantic factors, as Beth was saying. So argument structure has two faces. It is either semantic argument structure, which ought to be universal pretty much, versus syntactic argument structure, which has to do with how it's realized linguistically. One of the emphases in simpler syntax is how much can we get out of the semantics. And we are able to actually work on that question because we have an articulated theory of semantics that is designed to be mentalistic, namely conceptual semantics. And so with an explicit and fairly expressive theory of semantics that does the kinds of things that argument structure issues are supposed to deal with, arguments versus modifiers, those sorts of things, we're now in a position to really ask these questions in a fairly disciplined way, maybe not as formal as some people would like, people in formal semantics or computational linguistics or Bob Berwick or somebody would like, but enough to get a pretty good grasp of what's going on. So I think that's a difference.